Welcome everyone, and welcome Maria. We have with us Maria Arpa, who is a facilitator, mediator, dialogue expert, and the founder of the Center, I have it, Center for Peaceful Solutions. So Maria, well first, I'm really glad to have you here.
Yes, it's wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. And why don't you tell people about what is the Center for Peaceful Solutions and how you got to be where you are in your work.
Thank you. So it starts quite a long time ago. I mean, it depends how far back you want to go because I feel like I was probably destined to do this in some ways. But I would say that in my late 30s, having learned a few life lessons, and on the face of it looking quite successful, but finding, internally a spiritual desert.
Mm.
I was fortunate enough in one year to discover Marshall Rosenberg, Reiki healing, and community mediation.
Mm.
And all of those things came in one go. And I mean, it wasn't a gentle voice. It was like it was like something descended. And as I started to mediate neighbour disputes as a volunteer, and started to see that actually for me mediation can be quite just a reactive process because you're still waiting for something to happen in order for there to be a mediation.
Mm-hmm.
um I also started to notice that um if you mediate and all you do is deal with the issues in the present, then
Mm-hmm.
you never really get that social change element, that whole kind of different attitude to conflict. And that was where Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication came in handy. And when I started to imagine embedding the energy work, I started to recognize a very powerful cocktail, and then decided to go on that journey. And I moved into an area of London where there was a lot of gang activity. Of course, it's called gentrification. And coming from the slums, I never thought I could be part of gentrifying anything. But it was an area with a lot of gang activity, and I decided to see what I could do. So I went out on the streets in my neighbourhood. And literally, I mean, I know it sounds better than it is because most people cross the road and think you're crazy. But, when you stop people and talk to them, eventually a few people will talk to you. And
Mm-hmm.
that led me to meet a nightclub owner in a mile up the road. It led me onto what we call in London a housing estate, and you call the projects. And it took me into a couple of years of serious gang work, working out how people could negotiate with each other and be angry with each other, but not have to kill each other.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So I've lived in areas with a lot of gang activity too and gotten to know my neighbors. And I have mediated some conflicts, but never like between rival gangs, right? Drug dealer and his wife, or
Mhm.
is anybody getting hurt? Their arguments, or or just a kid beating up another kid
Mhm.
after a football practice. But that's that's uh, that's such powerful work. Backing up, I know who Marshall Rosenberg is, uh, and I know what Reiki is. But in case there are people on who don't know what one or the other of those are, can you just give us a little background?
Yeah, so Dr. Marshall Rosenberg was a scholar who studied under Carl Rogers, and Carl Rogers was known for developing the person-centered approach to therapy. Marshall was a psychologist who found that the academic world and the way we're governed and the way we treat each other had a powerful negative effect in terms of triggering violence in people. And when I say violence, I don't necessarily mean physical violence, but triggering a violent approach, an adversarial approach to life. And one of the things he recognised was that our use of language contributes to that. And so he developed something called nonviolent communication, which goes to the core of how we talk to ourselves and others.
Mm. Yeah, and so I heard three things. So I heard community mediation, right, which around here is a court diversion thing, right? Somebody's arrested for a minor conflict, a volunteer mediator comes in, and if the parties can come to an agreement, nobody has to be charged, or charges can get dropped. So nonviolent communication, which is communicating, owning our feelings and needs and making requests and hearing other people's feelings and needs. And then Reiki, which is like a body energy sensing and moving.
Yes, it's
like healing modality.
Channeling energy. A good way of describing it is feng shui for the body.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder which is better known, feng shui or Reiki.
Oh yes.
so and you put them all together. So tell us about what that means, putting them all together.
Yeah, so I came up with something called the dialogue roadmap. And that starts with noticing that even when we're trained as mediators, when we're sitting in the world that I call domination culture, which is the mainstream world. This is just a phrase. I didn't come up with it. A theologian called Walter Wink came up with that phrase. I've adopted it. So domination culture is the hierarchical bureaucratic structures where we tend to use power over each other. And noticing that within that structure, the model of conversation that we've been programmed to use is debate. And in debate, what we're doing is, the purpose of a debate is for one argument to prevail over all others. Yeah. And that might be good in a science laboratory, or it might be good in academia if we're discussing abstracts, but it certainly doesn't work when we're trying to find some shared humanity. So I really liked, I learned my nonviolent communication directly from Marshall, and I really liked the social change element that he had built in to his model. And I could see that this nonviolent communication gives us a way to change the way we talk to ourselves and our internal mechanism and the way we see others. But I didn't see it working as the way we should speak to each other. Okay. So I made this shift into thinking, well, if debate, and then of course when we go to school, we receive the worst form of debate, which is debate plus enforcement. And debate plus enforcement is the most toxic version that we can have, that creates all the wounds and the trauma and all the rest of it. And the things that we don't heal from, and then we go straight into adult life and into workplaces, recreating all of this, So I started to look at dialogue, and I couldn't find anywhere a how-to. There's no manual on what is a dialogue. And so that's what I've spent my life creating, is how to have a dialogue, because it comes from essentially a different place than a debate. A debate comes from the head. It's a thought out, logical process of knocking things over, building them up and knocking them over. Whereas a dialogue comes from the heart. And so that's where the Reiki comes, because we're looking at a different vibration. So I wanted to incorporate this idea of actually resonating, feeling our heartbeat, understanding what my vibration is, so that I could come from the heart and I use words to demonstrate the states that I'm in. And in a dialogue where the purpose of a dialogue is to understand that everyone has a piece of the answer. So we're not trying to win an argument. Everyone has a piece of the answer. And so in that place, I will be in a state of receiving. One part is receiving, that's the listening. Another state that I will find myself in is an empathic state. And that's where the feelings and needs come in. Another place is I may be receiving, but there's a balance between receiving and giving. So another state may be wanting to give people feedback, but that's a state of, so I'm looking at it in giving and receiving, meeting in the middle in empathy, and then finally the state of wanting to do something. You know, that happens. But rather than going to fix it strategies, I go into a state of what is going to support this situation in a collaborative conversation.
So there's a lot that sounds very familiar to me. And then I did have a clarifying question. So this whole idea, everybody has a piece of
the answer.
For a long time, I facilitated large group strategy meetings in a modality called future search, and we would talk about the parable of the blind man and the elephant. That, you know, instead of having somebody really arguing very strongly that this elephant is the tail, that there's a rope, and somebody else arguing very strongly that it's a rug because they've got the ear, we try to bring in all the pieces and get a picture. And that's even just for information, much less for you know, what's needed. So that sounded very familiar. And then also that we go through different states, and action is the final state. And my ex-girlfriend and I have this theory that all powerful methods have, or most powerful methods have 4 steps, which nonviolent communication does, and that people usually want to go straight from thinking to acting, and that you're going to have much more interesting solutions if you also include your feelings and then include something to do with importance, which in nonviolent communication, we look at needs, but there's other things about, you know, there's body sensations, there's possibilities, there's impacts, there's a lot of different modalities that have a different 3rd step. And so when you were talking about the different phases, right, there's the wanting to give, wanting to receive. At some point, you're going to want to act. That rang a bell with me. And so you talked about, so I think my question is about Reiki and states. So were you saying, it sounded like you were saying that like sensing our energy, moving our energy is part of how we can be intentional about what state to be in relationship to the dialogue. Is that what you were saying? Or
so I'm suggesting, so the way I talk about this is that there is something that I call the pipeline of self-love. So it is a stream of energy, it's free, it's streaming 24/7, 365 days, it never stops streaming, and you have a choice to connect to that stream or to stray away from it or to shut it off. When you stream that energy, you start to understand how things vibrate. You open intuition. And the way I describe intuition, as opposed to instinct, but how I describe intuition is being able to connect into the pipeline of self-love and get your USB and stick it into the cloud and channel other knowledge that isn't evidence-based. It's not based on science or needing to have something proven. And so what I'm also doing when I'm the facilitator or when I'm the mediator or whatever, I'm reading the energy in the room. I'm connecting to the vibrations, because after all, you see, one of the things that I've discovered is when you put a group of people together, and all we really want to do is we're trying to find the bandwidth or the band of vibration in which we can all operate together harmoniously. It will never be the highest vibration in the room, and we shouldn't let it be the lowest vibration in the room. So that's what happens. But if you use the debate model to squabble over it, right, you're actually lowering the vibrations. You're not building to the best channel, the best set of vibrations, the best bandwidth that we can all work in harmoniously. And that's what we're trying to do. And so for me, the energetic part is as important as the words we use. It's keeping in mind the pipeline of self-love and the meditation work that I do to put people into that place, to connect to it, is as important as the words, as the actions, as the strategies. All these things need to be aligned.
And so if you were coaching an activist or a group of activists, or even a group or even an organization, what would you offer them to, to be, I guess, to be like as calm and aligned and effective in their actions as possible? What kinds of questions would you ask?
So, yeah, I think there are 2 or 3 places I would want to go. And obviously, I'm just sort of summarising something, the works, in depth. So there are 2 or 3 places I want to go. First place I want to go is the pendulum swing, the internal pendulum. And what is the work we need to bring that to its sitting position, and that could be all sorts of things, that could be, why am I doing this? I'm completely crazy. Who do I think I am? No, I'm born to do this, all those kinds of different conflicting kind of ideas. So first of all, we want to get that pendulum down to its resting point. The second is the metronome. And I actually now use a metronome in trainings. It's really effective, because what tends to happen is when we get excited, and I don't necessarily only mean excited in a good way, I mean when our nervous system becomes activated, we tend to speed up. And when we speed up, I had someone who said, but you don't understand, I go at 100 miles an hour. My response was, and think about all the scenery you're missing if you were going at 15 miles an hour. So there's something about finding the metronome and actually moving the weight up and down to find the beat that you can operate in, and not allowing anyone else to change that beat, not allowing anyone else's nervous system to speed you up. So,
yeah.
And then the third thing that I want to look at is the channeling of love. So, one of the conclusions I've come to is that all we are is love taken form. And if I am love taken form, then you are love taken form. And the pipeline of self-love helps me to stream love. So I need to be streaming love at a constant, and the internal work helps me raise my vibrations to stream better quality love, or to stream it at a higher vibration. Okay, so the love is constant. I don't love you any more or any less because of what you do, but if I use my measurement of injury, loss or harm to see what is the potential for, or the actual injury, loss or harm, that's the dialogue. So I don't love you anymore as you're a human, I'm a human, we all need to eat, go to the bathroom, sleep, we all get sick, we all get angry, we all get all of those things. But the work for me is trying to keep the love constant. And then I can decide what game I want to play.
Mm. Okay. That was very powerful. I think it was pretty clear to me, and there's a lot to unpack there. Um, so first, I just want to say I love all these physics metaphors you have. It's like there's a river, there's a pendulum, there's a metronome. That's lovely. And so I think I'll start with the metronome. So my old time management coach, who I've actually interviewed for one of these shows, she also teaches with a metronome, and she's talking about entrainment, that we get entrained to the rhythms around us. We follow the rhythms around us, and you were saying, what is it like to not get caught up in somebody else's anxiety? And the fact is, it's not just the anxiety of the people around us. Our world is anxious and crisis filled and urgent. And what is it like to take a break from that urgency, right? Because I don't necessarily, like, the urgency of, late stage capitalism is artificial. And the urgency of, real crises, the urgency of preventing genocide or whatever, those are real. And if you're in that state all the time, there's so much you miss out on. There's so much capacity you lose. So, choosing to take breaks, or not breaks from the urgency, not necessarily breaks from caring or whatever, to have that still pendulum, right? To be able to be intentional.
So the question for me is, how do I continue to love myself when the world is behaving in ways that I don't like, hate, can't bear? How do I continue to love myself? And that's the starting point.
Yeah. Do you have an answer, or is that just an inquiry? And it may just be an inquiry.
Well, it's an inquiry, and then I would, of course, I would say this: the dialogue roadmap is one way to work on loving oneself, continuing to love myself, continuing to channel love.
Yeah, I really got that. And then what you were saying about the pendulum swing makes me think of inner dialogue, right? Which when I was trained in nonviolent communication mediation, sometimes we would mediate inner dialogues, and somebody would role play the part who thinks, I've got to do this really high risk, put my body on the line action. Are you crazy? Please don't do that. Or so, one thing is to have them like try to debate, and then you de-escalate and give empathy and let them get down to needs and dialogue. And I can imagine another, and then also maybe just quieting the voices until you can see what stability.
Yeah, I have a really good example of that. So it was the very first time I went into prisons. That was in 2009. And I literally was bringing my training to ask the prisoners whether they thought what I had was any good. Like, would it do the job? And I had a lot of lifers. And one guy came to the first two sessions and then didn't show up again until the second from last session, because, honestly, you'd think you have a captive audience in a prison, but he couldn't get off the wing to come, So, so he really missed out. And I said, you've missed so much. There's no way to catch you up, but if you want, you could be the subject. And this was a man who was at the start of a life sentence for murdering his wife. And what had happened was, in the intervening time that he'd missed all the sessions, he'd started taking drugs again, and he wanted to really explode out the part of him that wanted to serve his time, use the time to do something productive, and the part of him that had given up and just wanted to take drugs and whatever. And we did that, and he chose out of the group, he chose someone to play one part. He chose another prisoner to play the other part. And interestingly enough, because we don't ever have observers, so when prison officers come into the room, they have to participate in the training. They can't just be in the room. And interesting enough, when I asked him to choose someone to play his inner mediator, he chose the officer, which I thought was interesting. And it was a very powerful hour and a half because, he cried, and it's like, why'd I murder my wife? I've been in and out of prison all my life, and she's the one person that was always there for me. This was, and he couldn't cope with the guilt of what he'd done and the shame and the loss. And it was quite an astounding thing to see in an hour and a half, him actually, as you say, calming his nervous system down, calming down enough to be able to make a different choice.
Wow. Yeah. It's so interesting because in some ways I'm like, I can't relate to that at all. I would never kill anyone. And then in another way, I'm like, I can totally relate to wanting to be productive and wanting to be escapist and having two parts that are mad at each other. Absolutely, every day. Right. So
my thing would be, I'd love to do those mediations at the point where someone's thinking about killing somebody.
Oh, of course. Yeah. And Marshall tells a story like that in his experience in a prison, right? In Scandinavia, where he's talking about, I think it's anger and needs, and somebody, one of the prisoners starts crying, and he's like, what's up? And he says, if I'd known this a year ago, I wouldn't have killed my best friend.
Well, funnily enough, that's what this guy said. If I'd known this 6 months ago, I wouldn't have murdered my wife.
Yeah. People don't do things like that when they have options.
No, but it's really, what's interesting for me is being able to see the causality between the debate and enforcement model. Because, it's one thing, it's bad enough, a trained teacher using debate plus enforcement, but it's a whole other thing, somebody repeating that who's not got any boundaries.
Right. Yeah.
Because people only copy what they've seen. And then perhaps move the dial a bit further.
Yeah, no. We think enforcement will cause self-discipline, and very often it will cause trying to enforce on the next level. And if there's no
enforcement can never. You can get temporary compliance, you can get superficial compliance, you can get people who look as if they want to be compliant, but when you examine that compliance, none of it comes out of love. And that's a problem, when the compliance has come from fear of punishment, towing the line, not sticking your head above the parapet, all of those things. When the compliance has come just for a quiet life, someone somewhere is going to pay for that.
So there is so much more to talk about, and we're getting close to the end. So I asked two questions at the end. So one is, if there's somebody watching who is clear that they have a purpose, that clear that there's a difference they're supposed to make in the world, and they can't quite tune into quite what that is and how to get started, what would you offer them? What advice would you give?
So somebody who's clear they have a purpose and they don't know how to get started. So, interestingly enough, I feel that applied to me at one point. And what I did was tried everything. Network, talk to people, but don't talk at people. Talk to people to be curious. Watching this conference that you've put on, this workshop that you've put on, it's listen to your heart and figure out where you're inspired and work with what you can do. You know, we don't have to go out and make huge statements. You know, some people will, but you know, there's no such thing as an overnight success. You know, everything took a lot of time, everything took a lot of reflection, everything took a lot of practice, a lot of conversations. It's another pet peeve of mine is, you know, people go to a football match and to watch, you know, to get into a heightened state and watch two teams battle it out. But think about all the collaboration that went on for there to be a football association, for there to be two teams, for them to know what, for someone to build the football pitch, for someone to write the rules of engagement. You know, think of all of that went on. So much more of that happens than the actual moment of competition. And yet we train people to look at the competition and forget everything around it.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. And yeah, I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Maria, this was fascinating. Your work is really inspiring. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, you know, off the cuff, you know, if anybody wants to look me up, you know, my name's quite unusual, Maria Arpa. There aren't too many of us in the world. I do come up on Google, you can easily find me, and I'm willing to have a conversation with anyone that contacts me.
Great. And we'll we can put your email if you want, or if you have a booking page, we'll put that in.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this time. And thank you for what you're doing in the world.
Thank you. Now stop recording.